All right, my friends, we are about to really hit spanning tree protocol here hard and some other great Cisco switching features as well. Before we get started here, just a quick word. I am presuming you have watched the switching videos from the first section, from the ICND1 section. We barely mentioned STP there near the end. We had a lot of other fundamentals to go over, but I do not repeat all that material here. So you definitely need to have watched the first switching section before you watch these. And speaking of these, the first thing we're hitting is spanning tree protocol, because as in networking as in life, we'll take all the backup plans we can get, all the backup paths, all the redundancy, however you want to put it. And in switching, that redundancy takes the form of having multiple paths available between any two given endpoints in the network, because that helps us avoid the single point of failure. Oh, I get chills just thinking about it. In today's networks, it's just totally unacceptable. You don't want to be the person trying to defend how one port or one piece of equipment went down and we just didn't have a backup plan. You know, this one thing came down and the entire network came to a standstill. We are trying to avoid that, or are going to avoid it at all costs. Now, the benefit of all those additional paths that we're hoping we have does carry a little bit of danger, because if all of the paths in our diagram here were available at all times, we would end up with switching loops, because we've got a full mesh. Everybody's connected to everybody else. What we need is for one path between any two endpoints to be available, while stopping the other paths from being used unless the primary path goes down. And then, of course, you and I, being the network admins that we are and patient souls, we want that backup path to come up as soon as possible. That's something we're going to come back to a lot in the next couple of videos, the speed of that cutover. But first, let's talk about the fundamentals of the spanning tree protocol. STP, defined by IEEE 802.1d, does this for us, and what it's going to do is put ports along the most desirable path into forwarding mode, and ports along less desirable paths are placed into blocking mode, or a blocking state. Now, once STP converges, every port on these paths is either going to be in forwarding or blocking mode. At that point, you only have one path between any two destinations, and a switching loop literally cannot occur. And we'll see that on live Cisco switches in this section. Now, just a quick word here. I know that routing loops and switching loops don't sound alike, but on an exam or reading documentation, it's really easy to read switching loops and somehow think they're talking about routing loops. Because here's the deal. STP does such a great job with stomping switching loops into the ground that we really don't talk about switching loops that much. But as you advance in your studies, and if you check my YouTube channel out, I've got a video for you there that actually show you a routing loop on live equipment. We talk about routing loops a lot because they frankly happen more often, because we're more actively tweaking, shall we say, the routes than we are any switching paths. So you hear about routing loops so often, and then all of a sudden you're reading something, or you look at a practice exam question or a real exam question, and you see the phrase switching loops and your mind says routing loops. Just be careful with that. Spanning tree protocol has nothing to do with routing loops. It's a layer 2 protocol. It's used to prevent switching loops, and that is that. So what does STP do if a problem arises with that open path? Well, it's going to run the STA, the spanning tree algorithm, and it's going to recalculate the available paths and again just determine the best path. Now, ports along that new best path, they're going to be brought out of blocking mode and into forwarding mode, while ports along the less desirable paths, they're going to remain in blocking mode. Again, when STP converges, only one path is going to be available between any two endpoints. Now, we were talking a little bit just a screen so ago, let's see, about switching loops forming and how we want that backup path to become available as soon as possible. Well, their idea, STP's idea of as soon as possible, and yours and mine is a little bit different, but there actually is a good reason why. Ports do not transition from blocking to forwarding mode immediately. And when you need them to hurry up and transition, you're just thinking, oh, why do I have these other states? You know, why do we have these delays? Well, they help to guard against switching loops, because what can happen is you can have a link that does what we call flapping. You know, it goes up, comes down, goes up, comes down, goes up, comes down. You see the pattern. Then, if another port opened up immediately, then that flapping link is going to at times be up at the same time that the other port is up, and that's where switching loops can sneak in. So when STP detects a problem, it's not going to open that new path immediately. There are some built-in timers, built-in delays. We'll have those down for the exam, and we'll nail them in this section, see them on live equipment as well. And really, it's just this simple, though. STP, in this case, has decided the best path from 1 to 3 is the most direct path. And that is not always the case, but what we're assuming here that it is. Well, logically, switch 1 only sees one way to get to switch 3. Yes, we have those other physical connections because in this diagram we had a full mesh, but that's not going to be the case logically. Switch 1 just knows one way to get there. Now, if that path becomes unavailable, STP, again, it recalculates its available paths, and when that recalculation ends and we have STP convergence, everybody's agreeing on it, then the appropriate ports start coming out of blocking mode and into forwarding mode. Before we go into more detail about STP, one question is, why are switching loops so bad? Yeah, it sounds bad. Everybody says, yeah, you got to avoid those loops, got to avoid those loops. But why? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One is that frames can't reach their intended destination, either totally or in part, because when you have switching loops, the MAC address table entries are going to end up continually changing. Let's say a switch sees something coming in with the all A's MAC address on port 1. And you know what it does after watching the first switching videos. It looks at it and says, okay, here's the source MAC address, all A's. I'll put that in my table as being found off port 1. Then if you end up with a switching loop and that same frame ends up coming in on the same switch on port 12, it's going to say, well, wait a second, okay, something changed, and I'll change this address entry to find the all A's MAC address off port 12. So when those MAC address tables keep changing, ad nauseum, then totally or in part, the frames aren't going to get where they need to get. Obviously, this puts an unnecessary strain on our CPU. So that's a bad situation as well. And it gets worse because these continually flooded frames end up causing what we call a broadcast storm. You just end up with more frames circling around and more frames circling around and more frames circling around. And what starts off as a little teeny rain shower all of a sudden does end up being a storm, and it just hammers your switch at a certain point. Your switch will actually not be able to handle all of the traffic. And obviously it's an unnecessary use of bandwidth that we have all these frames flying around in loops. Now again, luckily for us, switching loops just don't occur that often because left to its own devices, STP does a fantastic job of preventing switching loops before they can occur. Now the benefits of STP begin with the exchange of BPDUs and the root bridge election. This is a feature or a situation we have to master. You have to be able to look at a diagram and say, okay, here's who's going to win this election. Here are the root ports, here are the designated ports, etc. When we head for the next video or come back for the next video, we'll start with a walkthrough on the board of a simple process root bridge election between two switches. And then in the lab, I've already cabled up a new lab. No one's ever seen this one before. I've got a couple of new ones for you here. And this one is going to bring in 3 switches, and it'll get a little more complicated, but we'll go around to each switch and see what happened from its point of view. So you will be ready for any root bridge election question on exam day. See you on the next vid.